everyone, welcome to another episode of the Acutis cast. My name is Will Deathridge. I am the CEO of Catholics for Hire, the sponsor of this podcast. And on the show, as always, we feature young Catholic professionals who do work with Catholics for Hire. And today we have Jaclyn Ross. Jaclyn, could you introduce yourself? Just tell us a bit about yourself.
Certainly. So I've been working for Catholics for Hire for a little over a year now. My background is in communication studies and theology from Loyola Marymount University. And I was able to spend several years doing direct ministry on the border down in Tucson before starting graduate level studies up in Boston. So I'm now in the DC area and have really loved the amount of work and projects I've been able to do here with CFH.
Great. And, as always on our podcast, we ask our guests to choose a quote from the company's patron, Blessed Carlo Acutis. And Jaclyn, if you could read off the quote that you chose, that'd be a great way to start off.
Yes, so obviously there's a number of good ones, but the one that really spoke to me was holiness is not the process of adding anything, but of subtraction. It is a removal of myself to make space for God.
Perfect. Why did that stand out to you in particular?
Ooh, I think because I've had the privilege of the difficult self-knowledge journey of self-subtraction, particularly the last several years with a lot of the difficulties I faced in COVID. The privilege I had with living in a community of religious brothers at the De La Salle Christian Brothers. And it's quite a long story, but I was also in a deep discernment with the Dominican sisters. Dominican sisters of Oakford, a very small congregation, but the sisters there really taught me how to begin a path that has led me, I owe to where I am today. And I think that quote really spoke to a lot of the major lessons that those sisters taught me.
Perfect. Tell us a little bit about that journey. I know you said it's a bit of a long story and all, but that's very relevant to us because this podcast is all about how young Catholics develop and increase their professional and personal lives through their faith.
Right. Well, one of the first things I was working with a Dominican sister down in Tucson. I was doing border immersion programs for high school students, and I was living in community with these five religious brothers, or these three religious brothers. It was a total community of five. And I remember knocking heads several times with several community members. And one of the sisters had told me that one of the things that you learn in community, having had 25 years of experience in it, that rubbing together is like the rubbing together of stones, where you start out this really ragged, jaggedy rock, and through those interactions of rubbing together, you are formed to become smooth. So yeah, it is a grinding away at yourself and your ego and your self-serving tendencies, but those are the things that make you more perfect in God's image and more perfect in the ways that God calls us to be.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. And currently, you mentioned you're obviously doing some work for Catholics for Hire. What else are you doing right now?
So right now I have the privilege of working in as an outreach specialist for the John Paul II National Shrine here in Washington, D.C. So I'm doing a lot of evangelizing through the life and legacy of John Paul II and inviting student groups and church groups and pilgrimages to come visit us and visit our first class relic, spend time with John Paul, and really understand his call to new evangelization in the year 2000, the Jubilee year, and how we can continue seeing the world through his eyes, as he was one who looked very closely to God.
Nice. Well, your quote is all about, it's kind of a less of me, more of God kind of approach. And it seems clear to me that throughout your career so far, you've kept things very ministry oriented. It seems like that's where your heart is, if I'm correct. Yes?
Yes, I would say so. I hope so.
Yeah. Well, so far so good, from what I can from what I've been able to see and all. But how do you do that as a young person? That's not exactly a lifestyle that a lot of people are pushed towards, whether that be because of the education system, the media. Doesn't always seem like we're formed to be virtuous, God-first human beings today. How do you go through a world where that might be a bit counterintuitive and do that anyways? How do you do that?
I really owe a lot of it to my formation in the Jesuit charism. I learned very particularly the ways that ministry is not so much myself coming into a situation to make it better, so much as accompanying those who are suffering. Um, and I think a lot of what spoke to me in this quote in particular is when we accompany, rather than coming in as the savior to make it better, or I'm going to come in and serve and preach God, and this is gonna make me feel better. Um, what accompaniment really focused on was shutting up and listening, first of all, and making room for the life and the suffering and the joys of another. And there is a lot of self-subtraction that goes into that, where a lot of times we look at what's happening in the news. If you look at what's happening in Palestine and Israel, if you look at what's happening on the border, if you look at what's happening in Ukraine, you have all of these things internationally, as well as the people living on the street, children going without food. I mean, you could go on, but I think what's difficult is that call to allow that suffering into your own life, to subtract oneself enough to make room for another. And that invitation is what allows the Spirit to enter into us through the lives of others. And it's also something very painful, because as you make room for the suffering of others, that suffering becomes your own, and it becomes something you can't look away from. So I would say that the joy levels out the suffering, because it is such an immense joy to truly love and accompany another. But it is truly a deep suffering, as we see on Christ's path to the cross, and his passion and his suffering. It of course eventually led to the resurrection, but he had to go through the passion first, and that is what he calls us to do, with our lives and the lives of others.
No, that's wonderful. I like how you bring that up, because it really it scales up that idea of accompaniment rather than approach where it's like I'm going to come into a situation and because I know better, I'm going to fix everything. One of our top clients is the Catholic University of America's Center for Human Rights, and we're in the middle of making a documentary about human rights with them. And in the midst of interviewing one of the scholars who's being featured in it, he worked in the human rights world. And one of the things he realized is how pervasive that mentality of we're going to go in there and we mighty Western Americans, we know best. And doesn't really matter what you guys, out in Africa or Central America think you need. We know better. And that almost always goes wrong, for everybody. There's an arrogance. It's about giving people what they need and what they tell you they need rather than giving them what you think they might need, right? And also doing it for the right reasons. Recently, I've been reading a book by Ronald Rolheiser, who's a phenomenal author, and I believe he mentioned it. It was either him or one of there was another priest in his community where I think at some point during their ministry they were offered to go and live inside an urban poor urban community that they'd been serving, and on paper it the optics look great. That's like an amazing resume builder. It's something where it's like, oh yeah, look at me, I'm living with people in poverty, but logistically doing that would have disrupted the whole community, right? I mean, I've known people who've every now and then there's like there are foundations and charities that'll come up or something like that saying let's build I don't know, like sports stadiums in Africa. Well, don't they need water first? Not to single those kind of charities out and all, but I just think it's very important. I agree with you. Accompaniment is two-pronged. One, it's giving people what they actually need versus what you think they need. And then second of all, doing things not for your own glorification, but keeping the needs of people first, putting them first like that. So I think that's a
Yeah, I
good
was very
insight.
privileged to do.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I really learned those tenets in I was able to do my study abroad program in a Jesuit at the Jesuit University in El Salvador. And so I
Oh,
spent
wow.
my semester abroad there. And when we first arrived, you've got a bunch of American kids coming down to Latin America, some of us for the first time, a lot of us not speaking English or English, speaking Spanish all the way yet. And one of the first things they told us was, there are a lot of problems in El Salvador as with the rest of the world. And if these problems could be fixed by someone like you, they would be. The Salvadoran people are smart. If these problems were easy enough to be fixed by, an undergraduate student, then they would be fixed already.
Right.
And so it
Right.
was, take yourself off the table and just better understand what the situation is here before you think that you have the ability to speak on it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's awesome. What are some common practices in daily life that can help you do that? Because you've spoken a bit about mission trip experiences. I brought larger examples like in the human rights world or, in charities, why it's important to have that. But in your daily life, what does this look like? This self-emptying with, just other people, whether it be in the workplace or just people you come across. What does that look like and how do you do that?
I think I, had the experience of what good ministry and what good accompaniment looks like before I knew how to do it well myself.
Hmm.
Um, and again, what one of the sisters in particular that I was kind of being informally formed under, as I kind of like to think about it, she really pushed me to look into, my own self. I think she had picked up on things in my past that were things that I was still holding on to, maybe difficulties or traumas that I had grown up with that I wasn't looking at. And made me realize that there are these things, parts of myself maybe that weren't good for me that I was holding on to that I needed to subtract and let go of.
Hmm.
And through the very difficult, self-reflection journey and, journey of, you know, therapy and being able to really look at myself and learn to sit with myself in all the good and all of the bad. I was able to see the parts of myself that maybe I didn't even want to look at. And I
Hmm.
can't let go of something if I don't know I'm holding on to it in the first place. So there were a lot of portions of myself that I very painfully, had to sit and look at and get to know very, very well, so that I could learn to let it go.
Hmm.
And that has made so much room for the sufferings of others and for the joys of others. And it has allowed me to think other people more clearly as I've learned to see myself more clearly, while reacting to things the same way I used to react, when I was kind of blind to the darker parts of myself.
That's good. And it
And,
seems like it's
I
come
think
up.
it's helped me love them better.
Hmm. No, that's good. And it seems like that's come with a lot of mentorship, self-reflection, and then surrounding yourself with people who can inspire you to do a better job, if I'm correct. Is that about right?
Yes, I've been very lucky with the people who've been on my path this far.
Yeah. Well, it takes a village for life. I think there's a part of our calling, where Jesus says several times that, the children will inherit the kingdom. There's having that childlike openness to perpetually learning and being vulnerable enough to understand that other people have done things better than you. So surrounding yourself with groups of people who can help you see your own weaknesses and develop from there. So, no, I mean, I think this has been a very enlightening conversation for a lot of young people who are striving to do a better job at integrating faith into their personal life and their work life. Do you have any final advice before we end things, Jaclyn?
Oh, I would, I think, only advise people to be comfortable with the things that make you uncomfortable.
Hmm.
Uh, you know, learn to be comfortable with sitting in the parts of yourself that are hard to look at. And learn to be comfortable at looking at the parts of yourself. You know, I'm not it's not easy for me to take compliments. You know, it's very difficult for me to sit and look at, you know, how wonderfully God made me. Um, and so I think learning to be comfortable in my own skin has been a journey of learning to be comfortable with my good and bads, um, and learn that, you know, these are the things that God made me with.
Now that's good. Last episode of the series, we interviewed Mary Ryan, who's our former director of, or our former project manager at Catholics for Hire, and her quote was about how looking at God makes us happy, looking at ourselves in an isolated, prideful sense that makes us sad. But a way to distort that is to fall into this sort of self-pity party kind of thing. So, it's so important to be able to see the beauty in yourself
Yeah.
despite your imperfections to avoid falling into just this despair of, how insignificant and weak you are because God made us in his image and he wrote his law on our hearts, is what the church believes. So, yeah, no, that's some very good insight because it's important to empty ourselves while recognizing our strengths, our talents, and our beauty like that. So, Jaclyn, thank you very much for sharing everything with us today.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much. And I feel very blessed to have the opportunity to kind of sit and really reflect on this in the midst of all my projects with Catholics for Hire. So thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, of course. And we hope that, listeners out there get a lot of insight from this as well and follow us on our YouTube, Facebook, and Spotify pages. And we'll see you guys next week on Acutis Cast.